In ancient Egypt, there was no income-based social class system like we have today. Since money hadn't been invented yet, Egyptian society was divided into three main classes: the royal family, free people, and slaves. Let's take a closer look at how this social structure worked. Being part of the royal family required a blood relationship with the reigning pharaoh. The pharaoh's siblings, children, aunts, uncles, and parents were considered members of the royal family. However, aside from the principal wife whom the pharaoh officially married, his other wives were not regarded as part of the royal family. Being part of the royal family granted the privilege of lifelong state support. In other words, they didn't need to work or earn a living. However, they weren't prohibited from working either. In fact, it was possible for them to hold positions in the government. Free people, both men and women, had two fundamental rights: the freedom to travel and the right to enter into contracts. The right to make contracts especially allowed them to marry and own property. While slaves could occasionally own property, they weren't allowed to sell or transfer it. Thanks to their contractual rights, free people could buy and sell land, buildings, or animals. Among all classes, only free people had internal distinctions between the rich and the poor. Wealthier individuals could gain influence and take part in state affairs by earning social prestige. Marriage, another important right of free people, didn't require a religious ceremony performed by priests or conducted in a temple. It was essentially a contract made in the presence of both families. As part of the agreement, both sides would exchange some of their valuable possessions. In addition, the bride's family would receive a virginity gift, a valuable present similar to the concept of a dowry or mahar in Islam. Since inheritance arrangements were typically decided before the marriage, property and belongings were usually divided accordingly in the event of a divorce. However, depending on which party initiated the divorce, the premarital gifts might have to be partially or fully returned to the other side. Additionally, a man was required to pay maintenance support to his ex-wife after the separation. However, this support would end if the woman remarried. Egyptian women had astonishing rights for the ancient world. They were legally equal to men and could enter into contracts, own property, and file lawsuits. However, men typically went to war, managed the government, and ran the farms. Women, on the other hand, were generally responsible for household duties and serving their husbands. While it's not known exactly what percentage of the population consisted of free people, evidence suggests it was less than half. This means the vast majority of society was made up of slaves. In addition to slaves, there were also serfs. The main difference between a slave and a serf was that slaves could be bought and sold, while serfs were tied to the land like immovable property. When a farm was sold, the serf's allegiance would transfer to the new owner along with the land. Both slaves and serfs were expected to obey their masters without question. Since legal marriage required a contract and the exchange of property, they were not allowed to marry. However, it was possible for a male and female slave to live together as husband and wife without a formal marriage agreement. Serfs were more numerous than slaves. Unlike slaves, they could sometimes gain their freedom, either by showing bravery in battle or by being granted emancipation by their master. In the early periods of ancient Egyptian history, there actually wasn't a slave class. Contrary to popular belief, the pyramids were not built by slaves, but by Egyptian laborers. The slave class began to emerge later, as prisoners of war were brought into Egypt. Over time, these slaves had children and continued to multiply, eventually making up the majority of the population.